Hi everybody, Captain Al speaking with your March Full Captain bonus video. This month we're covering the 747-400 airwork maneuvers, which include steep turns and stalls. I did this because the hydraulic system is actually a repeat video that I did probably a couple of years ago. But I went through it and it's actually very good. I usually don't like my videos, but this one I actually like. The information in it is good, I think well done, so there's no sense in reinventing the wheel on the hydraulic system. Then there will be a video on the systems Q&A, which will follow that hydraulic systems video. So let's take a look at first in the briefing. We're going to talk about steep turns and stalls, and then we'll go over to the arrow winks and do those maneuvers. So steep turns is one of the maneuvers that we have to do in training and on a check ride. The objective is to familiarize the pilot with the aircraft handling characteristics beyond 35 degrees of bank and improve your instrument cross-check. It's very much a scan maneuver and a control maneuver. We'll start out the maneuver where we stabilize the airspeed at 280 knots at 10,000 feet. We'll be normally on a cardinal heading of north, south, east, or west, as determined by the instructor or the examiner. And then once you're ready, we'll disconnect the autopilot, disconnect the auto throttle. We'll call for both flight directors to come off, which the pilot monitoring will do. And then usually command the pilot monitoring to set the heading bug 180 degrees from where you are. And then you'll also tell the pilot monitoring to give me a lead call of whatever you want. Typically it's about 20 degrees, but you could say give me a lead call of 30, 20, and 10. You could say, give me a lead call of 10 degrees prior. If you roll out faster, if you tend to roll out slower, then normally you'll do it around 20 to 25 degrees. I usually like to say, give me a call at 30, 20, and 10. So 30 is kind of the heads up, 20 is the start the rollout, and then by the time I roll out, I hear the 10 call and I'm almost completed with the rollout. So after we disconnect everything, the first thing we want to do is kind of stay where we are and note the power and note the pitch, because that's what you're going to return to when you finish the steep turn. As we start the turn, we're going to roll into a 45-degree bank while we're going to increase the pitch and thrust. Generally, the bank will be a slow roll in. You don't want to roll in fast because then it's harder to feel the pitch that's required. You want to roll in at a normal, slow, controlled rate. And then as you pass about 30 degrees, that's when you noticeably require the need for back pressure. And this is one thing we cannot simulate in the desktop simulation. We can't simulate the back pressure that's needed to hold 45 degrees of bank during the steep turn. And that 45 degrees of bank, once you get to that 45 degrees of bank and you add power to maintain your airspeed, there will be quite a bit of back pressure required. And we always recommend not to trim, because if you trim that back pressure off, then when you roll out, there'll be all that trim in there, and there'll be a tendency for the airplane to want the nose to pop up and for you to gain altitude in the rollout. So typically we will say, don't trim, just hold it. It's a lot of back pressure to hold. So generally after you set the power, your other hand that set the power will come over on the control column to assist in holding that back pressure. Things like the 757 or the 737 or any of these smaller airplanes feel like a little light twin compared to the 747. in a steep turn. The 747 will have a very heavy back pressure to keep you in a 45-degree bank turn at level flight. The steep turn is a 180-degree turn, and for training, we can do it a full 360 turn if we have to work on it, or we could roll into a 180-degree turn and then roll right back the other way, back to the heading. But when you do it on a check ride, it's a 180-degree turn, and once you stop the turn, that's pretty much where you have to stabilize. And the examiner or the instructor generally isn't going to tell you to turn the other way until he sees stabilization. So basically he wants to see you back at 280 knots, back on the heading, and at the altitude. When we do the 180-degree turn, generally we're going to begin that rollout around, I like to do 20 degrees prior. But again, it depends how fast you roll out. And in some cases, people may prefer 10 to 15 degrees, but for me, it's 20 degrees with the rate that I roll out. And then while you roll out, as you pass through 30 degrees again, you're going to have to slowly decrease the pitch back to where it was initially, and then the power is going to have to reduce to maintain the speed. Now, the reason we have to add power, of course, is because there's a loss of lift when you turn, and past 30 degrees of bank, as you make that turn to 45 degrees of bank, the airspeed will tend to bleed off if you don't add any power. With the GE engines on the 747-400, typically when you disconnect the autopilot, disconnect the auto throttle, and call for both flight directors off, the power will be right around 70% N1 at a typical mid-range weight. And the pitch will be about 2.5 to 3 degrees. 3 degrees is typical. And if you have the dual Q airplane symbol and the dual Q flight directors, the box of the airplane symbol will be kind of sitting on the 2.5 degree line, and that'll be 3 degrees. And once we start the steep turn, of course, as we pass through 30, we'll have to add that back pressure. So the pitch is going to go from about 3 degrees to about 4.5 degrees. And the power is going to go from about 70% N1 up to about 75 to 76% N1. So it's about roughly about a 5 to 6% increase in the N1. And it's about 1.5 degrees pitch increase. Now you'll notice in the AeroWinks when I do this, these numbers aren't quite accurate. They're actually a little bit less in the AeroWinks. And so you'll see that about 65% works good with the AeroWinks. And then when I add the power, it's up around 71%. So it's it's not quite as accurate as the simulator would be as far as power goes. Once we reach that 45 degrees of bank, then it's important to hold that 45 degrees of bank. There is a slight tendency to come out of the bank or increase the bank. So you have to be very careful to keep the bank angle at 45 degrees of bank. Now I'm using a stick when I do this, so I'm not using a control column. So as a result, I noticed it kept wanting to roll out. And you'll see when I critique myself that I'm rolling out a little bit and then I roll back in. And it's a little bit harder to keep the bank angle in there at 45 degrees with a stick. It seems to want to roll out more. In the Dash 8 with the GEnx engines, it's about 67% N1, so it's a little bit less than the 400. And again, the pitches are about the same, 3 degrees of pitch, and when you do the steep turn, you go to about 4.5 degrees of pitch. You'll notice in the AeroWinks, when I do this in the 400, the pitch is actually more like 5 degrees. In the 400, it's a little less than 5 degrees when you're in level flight. But I noticed with the AeroWinks, it's right at 5 degrees. And the box will be cutting through the 5-degree line when you're banked over at 45 degrees of bank, which is kind of a nice reference. And then when you add power in the Dash 8, it'll go to about 73 to 75% N1. Now these are ballpark figures because you do whatever is necessary to hold speed. But it's nice to know approximately what you're going to go to. So I know if I see 70% N1 when I start the steep turn, I'm going to add, just a little bump up in power to as I pass 30 degrees to keep the airspeed at 280. So you'll find that, again, it's about a 5 to 6% increase in N1 in order to hold that speed at 280 knots. And the pitch, again, has to go from 3 degrees up to about 4.5 degrees. Or in our case with the Airwings, it's up to about 5 degrees. And if you're using Pratt & Whitney engines, the EPR is around 0.96 EPR when you start. And then as you roll into the 45-degree bank, the power will go to about 1.00 to 1.02 EPR. And since EPR is primary with the Pratt engines and not N1. And again, the pitch is the same. It'll go from about 3 degrees to about 4.5 degrees at 45 degrees of bank, so no difference there. And again, we're going to demonstrate a couple of steep turns, one to the, I think it's one to the left and one to the right. And then, of course, once we roll out, like we talked about, you want to stabilize in pitch, stabilize in altitude, stabilize in heading, and stabilize on speed. So generally, altitude, heading, and speed, we look for stabilization. And so, because what can happen is some guys will roll out, and they might roll out and lower the nose to hold their altitude. But then as soon as they roll out and they reduce the power, they relax the pitch, and now the nose pops up, and they gain 100 feet after they recovered. And so generally you want to think of, I always tell my students when I'm doing this, that you want to think of the steep turn as not being done after you roll out. You want to think of that the next 20 to 30 seconds after you roll out, you're still doing the steep turn, in the sense that you want to make sure you're on heading, on altitude, and on speed. So that means you want to be 280 knots, you want to be at 10,000 feet, and you want to be on your cardinal heading. And if you're not, then you should make an effort to get back to that heading, or that speed, or that altitude. Now there are tolerances. You don't have to do this perfectly. But the tolerances generally on a check ride would be plus or minus 10 degrees, plus or minus 10 knots, and plus or minus 100 feet. Can you go outside of those tolerances? Yeah, you can a little bit, as long as you make an effort to get back in. Now, if you were to gain 500 feet on a steep turn, that's not gonna wash. But if you gained, let's say, 120 feet, but you made an effort to get back in to 100 feet, and it was only a momentary deviation, that wouldn't be a problem. But ideally, you want to stay within these tolerances and not violate any of these tolerances, because they are the check ride tolerances. Now let's talk about the stalls. The recovery maneuver is the same for all stalls. We want to recover at buffet or stick shaker, whichever comes first. And generally that'll be the buffet on the clean stall, and normally stick shaker on the turning stall and on the approach to landing stall. That will be the stick shaker. The only time you really get the buffet is when you're doing the clean stall. You'll feel buffet before stick shaker. Now, in the desktop, you're not going to feel that. You can kind of hear it, though. If you listen to the audio, you'll hear the airframe start to shake, but you can't feel it. And normally you will feel it in the simulator, that buffeting that starts. And really, we can recover right at that point. You only get that in the clean stall. In the Dash 8, you do get buffeting in the turning stall. And in the 400, you don't. But it's interesting, the Dash 8, you do. So you could actually recover at buffet on the turning stall in the Dash 8. You will get the airspeed low indication first, but that's ignored for training and for checking. So we just cancel the ICAS or cancel the oral alert, and we'll announce airspeed low, but we don't do anything about it because at that point we want to continue to buffet or stick shaker for the training and checking aspect of it. But in real life, it would be when you hear airspeed low, there's something wrong and you're going to recover at that point. And again, generally we want to apply positive nose down elevator to break the stall by reducing the angle of attack. We used to fly out of these stalls. We used to get the stick shaker and add power and level the wings, let's say, if we were in a turn, and we would hold the pitch where it was, and we would fly out of stick shaker. And that's the way we did it for years. But then because of the stall accidents that occurred, the FAA started to say we want to see a positive break of the stall. And we used to do it, again, for years, and you wouldn't lose any altitude. You would basically just maintain the altitude while you fly out of the stick shaker. Now it's okay to lose altitude. It's not. We don't want to lose a lot of altitude, but you want to break the stall, and so it is okay to lose altitude. You'll see on one of them that I do, I could have lowered the nose a little bit more than I did. I kind of lowered it after a couple seconds, and really you want to break the stall right away. So if I were critiquing myself, I would say that hey, you need to lower the nose a little bit more because you're kind of flying out of stick shaker. You want that positive nose down elevator to recover and stop the stick shaker, and then have the airplane lose some altitude. That's okay. And then as we recover, we're going to wait till the speed gets close to the bug speed, and then we'll pitch up slowly to maintain whatever altitude we lost. And again, during the recovery, it is okay to lose altitude. But once the speed picks up back to your bug speed, then we'll increase our pitch to hold our altitude. And then once we're back on speed, then we can continue climbing back to our initial altitude, which is going to be 4,000 in most cases. We do have to use thrust to start the acceleration. There was one instructor who was an examiner, and I had him for a proficiency check one time. And this is an instructor / examiner. And he was telling me it's mainly pitch on the stall recoveries, and that the power is not as important. And I said no, that they're a combination. I said if you do pitch only and you don't add power, you're shortly going to be in trouble. And he said, yeah, but you got to break the stall. I said, yeah, I agree, you got to break the stall, but you have to add power to power out of it. I said, if you don't add power along with the pitch, you're going to get in trouble. And he kind of disagreed in some sense. He said, well, you don't have to add a lot of power. I said, well, yeah, you do. You have to add enough power to fly out of it. And sure enough, we get in the simulator, and we do the first stall, and he lowered the nose, and he broke the stall, but he didn't add power. He didn't move the power at all. And it didn't take long before we were into deep stick shaker with the airplane shaking like a son of a gun and losing altitude because we're now in a deep stall. And the only way out of that then was to break the stall, lower the nose again. Luckily, we had altitude. But I think in this case, he didn't add the power, and so we just got into this deep, deep stall and started descending rapidly, and I stopped the simulator. I just watched it for about, I'd say, a good 30 seconds until I could see that things were getting out of control fast, and I stopped it. And I said, so what was wrong with this? and it turned out to be certainly the power. So I made him a believer that day that if you don't have power, you're not gonna fly out of it. You're gonna get right back into it. So power thrust is required to start the acceleration. Yes, we want to break the stall with pitch, but you have to add power as well. in order to start the acceleration out of it. If the speed brake is extended, we need to stow it, and we do that on the first stall, which is called a level off stall, and we will have the speed brake out in that case. We're going to maintain lateral control with ailerons. We don't use any rudder. Rudder can aggravate things. So if we need to maintain any lateral control, it's with ailerons only. And we look through the flight director. We don't use the flight director. The flight director is on when you're doing this maneuver because it's simulating a situation where you didn't realize perhaps that the auto throttle was off. And there's 3 situations that we do this in with the autopilot engaged. And once we get buffet or stick shaker, that's when we can disconnect the autopilot and recover at that point. And we don't change gear or flap configuration until we're safely out of the stall. And in this case, they're talking about the approach to landing stall, which we do on an ILS approach. And generally, during the stall recovery, we're not changing gear or flap. But once we get back on speed, then we would decide to, in that case, go around. We used to teach this that you could, as long as you had control of it, you could continue with the ILS. So we used to do this landing stall on the ILS, and then we would say, go ahead and continue to follow the flight director and for a manual landing for the ILS. Well, the FAA didn't like that because they said if this happened for real and you were surprised by it and you're on an ILS approach, are you going to continue the approach? You're probably going to go around and sort it out then what happened. So yeah, I kind of agree with that. For training, I always liked doing a landing out of it instead of just going around. But on a check ride, we teach them to, once you're back on speed, now it's a missed approach. It's not don't try to land. We still may do it in training to a landing because we want to do something other than the miss. And manually flown ILS to a landing at that point in the training is actually good. But on a check, you need to go around. So here's the 3 stalls. One is called a level off stall, the other one is a turning base stall, and the other one is a landing stall. And so the level off stall will be normally we're at 6,000 feet, and the instructor or the examiner says descend and maintain 4,000. And then the student would put in 4,000 and he'd select flight level change. And then the next thing out of the instructor's mouth or the examiner's mouth is expedite to 4,000. And so since we're already at 250 knots at 4,000 feet, we can't increase the speed. So the only thing we could do is add speed brakes. So we bring the speed brakes, extend the speed brakes, and then as we're descending to 4,000, the instructor/examiner will disconnect the auto throttle from the mode control panel from the auto throttle arm switch, and then have the student clear the warning with the auto throttle disconnect on the control column. And this is all done on the autopilot. The autopilot's engaged at this point. And so as we get to 4,000, the airplane will level off at 4,000, but the auto throttle is not engaged. And the auto throttle arm switch is off, so the auto throttle is not going to come back. Even if it had a wake-up feature, it's not going to come back because you have the auto throttle arm switch off. And so as the airplane slows down, we'll get the airspeed low, and we'll recognize that, but we won't do anything about it. And then we can recover at buffet or stick shaker, whichever comes first. Now you'll see I took it down to stick shaker. I probably could have recovered when I heard the airframe because I can't feel it, but I heard it on the Airwinks. So I could have recovered at that point, you'll notice on the clean stall, but I let it go to stick shaker and then I recovered because I didn't feel anything. And then once we recover out of that, normally the autopilot's put back on once you're back to 4,000 feet and you're on speed. The autopilot comes on, and then we'll direct the student to select go to flaps 5, but don't increase the flap setting beyond flaps 5. So he'll go flaps 1, flaps 5, and then once he's at flaps 5 on speed, we're on a downwind leg for the ILS, and then we'll have him turn base. And as you're turning base, again, I'll disconnect the auto throttle from the mode control panel. And then again, that's a positive disconnect when you take that arm switch and turn it off. I'll have him bring the thrust levers to idle. And then we're in a turn, and the airplane's slowing down. It slows down, slows down, slows down. Now we get stick shaker. When you get stick shaker, that's when the student can recover. So at that point, he'll call stall, and then he'll disconnect the autopilot and add power, break the stall, lower the nose, add power, level the wings since you're in a turn, and get back on speed to flap 5 speed and stabilize at the altitude that you're at, and then you can climb back up to 4,000. And then once you're at 4,000, the autopilot would come back on. The auto throttle arm switch would come back on. The auto throttle will go back into speed mode, and then you'd be ready for the next stall, which is going to be the landing stall. And on that one, we'd go flaps 10 as we're approaching the localizer, and then intercepting glide slope alive, gear down flaps 20, arm the speed brakes, glide slope intercept flaps 30, and then we start down on the ILS. And then at that point, again, the instructor/examiner will take the auto throttle arm switch and turn it off, or he could turn the auto throttle arm switch back on after the student recovers from the stall. That's what I generally used to do, because I knew the student was going to go around, and if he goes around after he's stabilized, he's going to push toga and he's not going to get the auto throttle because the auto throttle arm switch is off. So and you'll see that I did that. Obviously I have nobody helping me, so I left the auto throttle arm switch off and I did a manual go around. I basically pushed toga and advanced the thrust levers manually. So once we're on the glide slope, we will again disconnect the auto throttle from the MCP, mode control panel. The instructor examiner pulls back the power to about 55% N1 in the 400, be about 45% N1 in the Dash 8. You'll notice in the Airwinks, I had to pull it back to about 50%. At 55% was too slow for the deceleration, so I pulled it back to about 50% to get it to slow. And then again, when we get the autopilot, of course, we'll pitch up in order to maintain the glide slope, but meanwhile the speed's dropping off. And as the speed continues to drop off, then we'll get to the point where we get stick shaker, disconnect the autopilot, call stall, break the stall, and at the same time add power. And again, it doesn't take full thrust, but it takes a lot of power. It takes about 70-75% of it. And then as the speed comes up and you get back to bug speed, then you can reduce your rate of descent if you're still going down. And hold your altitude, be back at the bug speed, and then at that point you would decide to go around. So at that point it would be go around thrust, flaps 20, pause rate, gear up, and then you go with the go around procedure at that point. So that's the approach to stall. 3 of them: level off, turning base, and landing. And these are all done on the check ride as well for part of the Airwork maneuvering. So with that, let's go over to the Airwinks and take a look at these in action.